Hello friends. I just wanted to talk a little bit today about the Snider Enfield short rifles here. Of course my cat's trying to photobomb. But what we have here, we have one of the earliest Snider Enfield short rifles. So you can see it's got a lock date of 1861 from Enfield. And if you look, the thing will focus here. You can see it has a little SR under the view mark. That signifies that it's a short rifle lock. So these were supposed to be a superior lock. The sear had extra clearance on each side so it didn't rub on the lock or on the bridle. So these 1861 short rifles were originally muzzle loaders, and they were never really issued. 1861 was really late in the game, so muzzle loaders were becoming obsolete at that time, and I think what ended up happening to the majority of these is they were put into storage in the Tower of London in case there was a war of some sort, and they were just never issued, so they were sitting in storage. And when they started the Snider conversions, I don't think all of them, but the overwhelming majority of these 1861 short rifles would have been converted to Sniders. So this is one of them, and this is also an extremely rare variant of the Snider. This is a Mark 1 star. So as you may be aware, the Snider came in a Mark 1, a Mark 1 star, a Mark 2 star, which I believe the way it works was the Mark 1 was the original, the Mark 1 star was modified for the squared off base of the newer cartridge, and I believe the Mark 2 star was exactly the same, with the exception being that it was a newly made shoe and breech block rather than a converted one. But the Mark 1 star short rifles are quite rare. They're very rarely seen. But what happened at the end of the U.S. Civil War, the British were kind of concerned that, well, the Americans have this huge army with nothing to do all of a sudden, so the concern was that they were probably going to turn toward Canada and attempt to annex Canada. So as soon as the Snider conversions were out, the first, this would have been 1867, I think. Basically, the Snider was brand new in British service at that time, and there was enough of a concern in Britain at the time that the Americans would attack Canada, that I think the first issue of Snider rifles was to Canada. So we ended up in Canada with a lot of the really early variants that you don't see anywhere else. Like I've never actually even seen another Mark 1 star short rifle for sale. But this one here doesn't have any markings that would suggest Canadian ownership. It has the roundel on the butt. It says Royal Manufactory Enfield, and the 1 signifies it's a first class arm. And there's an Enfield inspector mark in the middle of the roundel, but there's no unit markings, there's no DC and a diamond or anything, but the fact that it is in Canada probably suggests with a fair degree of certainty that it is a Canadian issue rifle. The only thing that it does have on it is this XII, the Roman number 12. So, I was thinking maybe it belonged to Brother 12's cult, because this rifle did come out of BC, so you never know. But I would think that Brother 12 probably had more modern weapons than these things. And I'll just take a quick look at how this action works. So, on the earlier marks of Snider, there's no positive lock, so you can just flip the breech block open, get my hand out of the way. So you can see there's a little spring-loaded pin in the back, and that just goes into a hole here. That's what, that when you close the breech block, that just snaps shut. So there was no actual mechanical means of locking the breech block shut. So the fear was, and it did happen too in service with the earlier marks of ammo. Now, like, you have to understand that the Snider ammunition wasn't a modern drawn brass case like these. It was actually an iron disc, and then a base, and then the primer went through the iron disc and crimped the base on, and then the actual body of the case was made up of coiled brass and paper. So it was a rather complicated cartridge, and it could, well, it did happen in service where they would actually open up and blow out in the earlier marks. I think the Snider ammunition went through something like 9 marks in the short time that it was in service, as they were trying to perfect the cartridge. But the earlier marks would definitely come apart on you. And then, of course, the gas would get underneath the breech block and flip the breech block open. I don't think anybody ever got seriously injured with it, because the nature of the design, the forces come straight back. So I think I remember somebody had the rim of the cartridge came out and hit him in the forehead or something like that, but it wasn't a terrible injury. It was just a scratch. But nevertheless, it would be somewhat disconcerting, to say the least, to have your rifle blow open on you. So they went from the Mark 1 star to the 2 star, which, as I've always said, was basically the same. And then the 2 star variant had a hollow hammer face. The idea was that it looked actually very much like the hammer on the Enfield muzzleloader. So it would come down and it would go over the cone here, where the firing pin is, and when it touched that would, in theory, hold the breech block down. And I think that actually was quite successful. I don't remember reading of any problems with that. But what they ended up coming up with in the end, now, what we have here is one of the last of the short rifles. This is a Mark III. So the Mark III wasn't a conversion. The Mark III was actually newly made. And one of the ways you can tell them at first glance is, if you look at the older rifle, you can see this pin in here. So the pin was actually for the ramrod spoon. Like the Enfield muzzleloader, you could pull the ramrod out, obviously, and they would have the spring-loaded spoon that was pinned into the stock. And when they converted these, they did away with the spoon and the spring, but they would keep the pin. Obviously, you don't want to have that hole opened up, so they would put the pin back in after they threw away those parts, and then they would turn down the cleaning or the ramrod, make it lighter. And what they would do is inlet a little square nut into the stock that's held in place by the trigger guard. So then after the conversion, you would actually screw the cleaning rod into place. But if you notice here on the Mark III, there's no pin. Being a newly made one, it's interesting too, because the Mark III is actually slightly heavier because of that, because it doesn't have the large cutout in here. So it actually does change the balance markedly. You wouldn't think that small amount of wood would make a difference, but it is quite noticeable. But anyway, the Mark III, in addition to being newly made, see if we can set this up here, introduced what they called the positive lock. You can see the screws are kind of a little bit mashed up. I'll probably repair those at some point. So you half cock, and then you have to press this little catch in order to open the breech block. And there's still a little bit of rust in here. I've got the bore soaking in some cleaner, so don't mind that. It's just a little puddle. I'll clean it out later. But as you can see, that snaps shut. So you actually have a mechanical lock holding it shut. But you'll also notice there's a little bit of play in that, you see. So the Mark III wasn't an entirely successful design. It came out at the very end of the Snider era. I think the first ones came out around 1869, 1870-ish. And of course the Martini Henry was already coming into service around 1871. So you can kind of see that they took a lot of meat out of the block to accommodate this lock. And also in the breech tang, again, don't mind the crud in there. I've got this thing soaking in ballastol to dissolve all that. This breech block was actually frozen shut when I obtained the rifle, and it took considerable work to get it out. I had to beat on this with a rubber hammer until it went in, and then, of course, after it went inside, then the breech or the locking bolt was actually frozen into the breech block, and it took considerable work to get it freed up to work. But the Mark III, in my opinion, I think some people won't have anything but a Mark III. They're like, oh, the Mark III is the only one that has a positive lock. I wouldn't shoot one of those other ones. Well, unless you're really, like, you're messing around making ammunition out of plastic shot shells or some kind of hokey method, or trying to get the last use out of your brass that probably should have been thrown away, the likelihood of the Mark, the earlier Mark blowing open on you is virtually non-existent. The problem that you have with the Mark III is that a lot of them, in my experience, tend to be loose. It's a weaker action all around. Like, the positive lock is nice. It's fun to operate. It makes a satisfying noise when you shut it. It has the fun little latch to push when you open it and all that. But in actual reality, it's not really as strong as the earlier Marks, just because of all the metal that they took out of it. So what will often happen with the Mark III, you'll see it, this one was a prime example actually, is that the back face of the breech block will end up, and this is really common also, I should mention, on ones that guys have shot smokeless powder out of. The smokeless powder is really hard on these actions. It'll batter the back of the breech block to the point where you end up like this one, where when you open it, the back face of the breech block is so battered that the pin the locking pin will go in and can't come back out. Now that's not the ailment that this particular rifle suffered from, and I had a devil of a time getting that locking bolt out. I had to take it out and polish it, and then very carefully bore out the hole in the breech block. And of course, when it froze, some well-intentioned person tried to pry it open with some sort of tool. I managed to hammer the bent part of the breech block back down into place here, and then very carefully dressed it with a file, so it's taken back its original profile. Unfortunately, it's taken the patina off, but that'll grow back over time. I didn't do anything to the shoe itself, so you can still see the mark where somebody was prying on it, and they did the same thing at the back as well. They tried putting various implements under here, trying to pry the thing open, and it all in all, it cleaned up quite well. But this is a good opportunity to point out that the Mark III action isn't really what people think that it is. It's not a stronger action by any means. The other thing about this one too is, this being a newly manufactured one, it's going to be upside down in the picture here, but you'll see, yeah, you can see right there, it actually says steel on the barrel. So the newly manufactured rifles were actually made with steel barrels, and in some cases a steel action. Most of the time the shoe and the breech block continued to be iron. Malleable iron was a lot easier on machine tools and everything, so they tended to carry on with that because it's a very complex shape. So you'll usually find these, like the shoe and the breech block will be iron, the latch will be steel, the locking bolt inside will be steel, as is the screw, the firing pin will be steel, and the axis pin on the side will be steel. But generally the rest of it is usually iron. But the steel barrels too are neither here nor there. Some people will say, oh yeah, well, you have to have the steel barrel because that's safer than the iron. Yeah, the steel barrel was all the rage when it first came out in the 1860s. Everybody had to have a steel barrel, and they fell out of favor very rapidly. The early steel wasn't that great, and the biggest complaint that you usually see in old books was that the steel had a tendency to chip. It would actually develop chips in it. So I get like the steel gun barrels at that time were basically in their infancy. So I suppose it's to be expected that there would be some teething issues. So again, like I said, if given the choice of a mint condition iron barrel or a slightly used steel barrel, I would definitely take the mint condition iron barrel. Now this one here, the bore in this early short rifle is, I would almost say it was never fired. It's virtually mint. But so anyway, a little bit more about these Mark IIIs. As you can see, this one has the DC and the diamond on it, and it has beautiful tabby stripes in the wood. These last run of short rifles made by BSA tended to have really nice wood on them, and you can see it's marked to the 38th Battalion, which is the 38th Dufferin Rifles, and its stand number is 147. And that's using the terminology of the time. That you tend to see them called rack number now, but at the time that was called the stand number, so that's the terminology that I use. And you can see the Birmingham roundel is still on the butt. Unfortunately, it's taken a bit of damage, but you can still make it out. And you can see the upside down broad arrow on top here, which signifies that it was sold out of service at some point. Now these probably would have been sold out maybe in around 1896, I'm thinking. 1897-ish. The Lee Enfield entered service in Canada in 1896. That was so the two times that Canada was right on top of things in the world in the 1800s were the Snider Enfield and the Lee Enfield. We got the first Lee Enfields made in 1896. I believe Canada bought like 40,000 of them or something, so they went out on issue to replace the Sniders. No, Canada was still using the Snider as its standard military rifle in 1896. And of course, a lot of units probably carried the Snider right up until they got the Ross because there weren't enough Lee Enfields to go around. But we ended up getting these obviously didn't come with the first consignment of Sniders. I think Canada got 30,000 of these originally that were gifted to Canada in 1867, and then the government actually purchased more of them later. So this is obviously one of those that came later. Most of these ended up going to artillery regiments. You quite often see them marked to the Montreal Garrison Artillery or so on and so forth. And you can also see, if this thing will focus, Oh, come on, focus. Yeah, you can just barely see it on the camera here, but it's dated BSA Company 1872, and you can see the broad arrow nose to nose has been stamped over part of the BSA Company stamp to show that it was sold out of service. So this particular one actually belonged to a rifles regiment. They're Everybody wants one that says Queen's Own Rifles on it because they were actually involved in the 1885 action and all, but yeah, unfortunately you find one with Queen's Own Rifles on it, they want a king's ransom for them, so I'm quite happy to have one with whatever on it. They're just really nice rifles to have. So the other thing I see quite often online, these, I wouldn't use these for shooting now. Somebody fired them a long time ago and never cleaned them, obviously. But these are a really short case. You can see if I can find one that you can read easier. I think this one's a little bit cleaner. See, DC Company 57 Snider. And this one obviously took a couple of cracks to go off to. It's got two firing pin marks in it. Or maybe the fellow was using them as snap caps or something. But they're a really short case. Now you can look next to the standard Snider case. And you can see it's quite a bit smaller. And these come up online quite often. You see them in the forums and on Facebook and everything. Somebody will say, oh, I have these short cases. What's the story behind them? And then some so-called expert will come on there. Oh, those are the cadet load, blah, blah, blah. And spout off some nonsense about how these were the special cadet load. They weren't a cadet load at all. There was no such thing. There was no cadet load in Canada. We did convert a lot of the 3-band long rifles into what we call in Canada the cadet carbine, but they actually weren't intended to even be shot. They were for drill, and that was very late in the Snider era in Canada. I think around 1905 or 1908 or somewhere around there. But what these were, Dominion made these. So the original case, the Snider case, was made up out of so many different things. It had a lot of volume taken up inside the case by the thickness of the brass and paper and whatever. And so when Dominion made these, they just shortened the case so you didn't have to have so much loose powder bouncing around inside the case. And it actually made some sense to shorten it as well, because as you can see with... Let's just open this guy up. Okay, stay. Okay, so you can kind of see here, you see the breech block or the shoe. So you'd have to put the bullet in first. So when you want to unload the rifle, it can be somewhat awkward if you're taking the loaded cartridge out, because you have to kind of turn the rifle over and drop it out at an angle, where with these shortened cases, when the bullet is on here, they're actually exactly the same length as the loading trough. So when you eject, or let's say when you extract a loaded round from it, you just turn the rifle over and it neatly falls out without getting hung up by the bullet. So it does make some sense actually to shorten it. And these are not any kind of reduced load. They still have the full service charge. Actually, I think they may even have a little bit more than the service charge in there. I think they may be about 75 grains or something. I have fired a couple of them, and they seem to be pretty hot. And I opened one up to examine it, and it appeared to be loaded with 3F black powder. So they were a pretty potent little round. They were definitely nothing whatsoever to do with cadets. These were actually sold in Canada up until Probably at least the 1930s, if not beyond. I know I've talked to old-timers that purchased these new in the stores into the 1950s. So whether they were still being made then or whether they were old stock, I have no idea. But they were. I think the Snyders were in use for a long time, like particularly among poorer people that didn't have the money to buy the latest thing. You could buy a Sporterized Snider for a really cheap price. I think the 1920s, the Canadian government divested themselves of most of those that were still in their arsenals, and the majority of them ended up having the stock cut right here and rounded off, and then they'd put a kind of a crude plug in to cover the ramrod channel, and they would grind off the bayonet lug. And I seem to recall reading that the cleaning rods were sold to florists to make like the wreaths for Remembrance Day and that sort of thing, where they have like the little stand where the wreath stands up. That's what the ramrods ended up getting used for. But anyhow, I just wanted to talk a little bit about these. I have shot the Snyders extensively. I first started shooting them, I think, around 1998. And I found them to be quite accurate, actually. They were a lot of fun to shoot. I used to have, I think, around 100 of the turned brass cases that NDFS used to make in England, and you can't get those anymore. Unfortunately, you're now using these. They're actually 24 gauge brass shot shells, and they take pistol primers. Not 100% happy about that, just because like when the hammer on these Snyders comes down, it's like the crack of doom. And I do have some concern that the possibility of puncturing the primer could be very real. What I have done in this particular one is I've shortened the firing pin a little bit, which should help matters some. But you don't want to shorten it too much either, because then you'll end up with this taking too much of the force of the hammer, and the nipple will end up cracking on you. But they tend to be quite accurate. This cartridge is loaded using the regular Lee. I think they're called a Burton bullet. They call it their Civil War Mini. It's actually a Burton bullet, and I've read various accounts online that say that these are absolutely horrible. You can't hit anything with them. Guys have reported firing 50 of them off and not even hitting the paper, but that wasn't my experience with these at all. What I did find with them, though, was that they had to be cast out of a harder metal than pure lead. I know it's counterintuitive. People say, oh, you have to have the pure lead or the bullet won't expand, blah, blah, blah. But that was not my experience at all with the Snider. What I did find was that when I went through a long process of trying to find an accurate load, and I had a bunch of wheel weights. I cast some of these bullets out of wheel weights. Not pure wheel weights. I had some pure lead still in the pot, and I added the wheel weights to it. But when I did that, I found the accuracy was actually quite good with these bullets. And the most accurate bullet I found was made by Rapine at the time. It was a 585 or 589 or something. I can't remember what diameter it was, but it was called a trash can, and it was completely flat-nosed. And the old fellow that was selling the brass at the time in Alberta, Norm Walden, he actually recommended those to me, and he said he cast them out of a fairly hard metal. He said that they don't seem to work as good out of the soft metal, and he sent me a bag of them to try, and I was actually shocked at the accuracy potential with that bullet. And I think you can still get that bullet. Rapine is long gone, but I think Moose Molds now sells that mold. Unfortunately, they're incredibly expensive. They're something like $200 US or something. But the what people are doing now, and they've had quite good success with them. They're using a 600 bullet, and I have mixed feelings about that. First off, I think, well, the original issue of the Snider used the hollow-based bullets, and in my opinion, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to attain at least the accuracy that they achieved in the 1860s using those methods. The other thing is that a lot of the Sniders, like, you have to remember, this was these things are a product from relatively early in the industrial age. There was still a lot of handwork and things. They aren't 100% consistent, so you do have quite a few of these that will have a tighter bore than normal. And what I had in particular with one rifle, it was a Mark III long rifle that had been converted backwards into a 2 star. Somebody had it was professionally done. It wasn't a hack job. I suspect it was done in service for competition shooting, because the target shooters didn't like the Mark III action either. But and it had a Mark II 2-star action from LSA fitted to it. And that particular rifle, that was my first Snider, and I started shooting it, and I was using, I believe it was a 591 bullet that was marketed at the time, and it shot really well initially. I think I was using a charge of around 50 grains. I was advised to start off low and don't go too high with that bullet. And it did shoot well, but accuracy started to drop off really quickly. And eventually I just stopped using that mold altogether. It wasn't working. You want to talk about not being able to hit the paper? This thing was throwing 1 in 5 shots completely off of the paper at 50 yards, and I couldn't understand what was going on. But I was cleaning the rifle one day, and something felt a little bit odd in the throat, and so I started moving the cleaning rod back and forth in around this area, with a tight-fitting patch on. I kept feeling something really rough there, and what ended up coming out of the breech was an actual, it looked like a washer made out of lead. So the throat was actually shaving those oversized bullets off and depositing lead, and I was having issues with chambering too. That's why I stopped shooting the rifle, because I couldn't get the cartridges to chamber anymore. And that was really it was actually quite frightening, because you can only imagine what that would do. That would create a huge pressure spike as your bullet is trying to get through the throat that's already fairly tight and is getting smaller and smaller, and of course it was destroying the bullet on its way through there. That's why accuracy was going out the window. And I stopped using that bullet after that. I decided that wasn't a very good idea, but it's kind of distressing now to see that a .600 bullet is actually being promoted for these, and I'm sure some rifles need it. Like, you probably have some that are that oversized, but I would just suggest to do your homework. Make sure that you slug your bore, check out what the dimensions of your chamber are, some of the commercial Sniders in particular. I had a Pritchett sporting Snider, and I don't think that would even have chambered the 590 bullet, let alone a 600. It was really tight, and I couldn't chamber the brass from any of the other rifles that I had in it. And I've just seen somebody mention the same thing about a Thomas Turner Snider as well, that he said it wouldn't chamber any of the brass from any of the military Sniders. So it's something you have to approach with caution. I mean, you have to keep in mind these rifles are 150 years old minimum now. So you don't really want to be messing around with something like that. The reason I've gone back to using this type of bullet is I like to have, I have more than one Snider. I have 4 of them. So I like to have one round that I can use in all 4 rifles. Like all 4 of my Sniders are shootable. They're all shooters. So I don't want to. I've never been the one to go to the trouble to work up particular loads for a particular rifle. I've always would strive to develop a load that would work in all of the Sniders, or Lee Enfields, or Martini Henrys, or whatever that I had at the time, and make that one load so it would work adequately in all of the rifles that I had. And some would shoot the load better than others, but the point was that you could take that round and put it into any one of the Sniders that I owned and not have to worry about it bursting or making shotgun patterns on the target or whatever. So it is something to keep in mind. If you have only one Snider, you're 100% confident in the bore size, I would by all means go with that .600 bullet that everybody likes. One thing I do disagree with, though, I see a lot there, the people dipping the bullet in that utterly smooth cream, and I don't think that's a really wise idea. I don't want to offend anybody that's a proponent of using that, but when they went through the same thing with the 1903 Springfield for a while. They had I can't remember what the name of that stuff was. There was a special grease that there was some kind of moly grease at the time. There they actually made a special bullet greaser. You dipped the bullet into the greaser before you loaded it, and that was supposed to make your bore shine and make your rifle more accurate and all kinds of things. But that's actually one of the reasons that the 1903 Springfields were bursting. Is what happens when you do that. You apply the grease to the bullet, but then it has to slide in through the chamber. So what happens, anything that you put on the bullet is getting into the chamber, and you'll even see that in the videos where guys are shooting it. You can see that utterly smooth cream is getting on everything. I'm sure it's great for your hands, but what'll happen, it gets on the brass, and your brass isn't gripping the chamber walls anymore at that point. It's floating on a film of that utterly smooth. It's essentially the same thing as not washing the case lube off of your brass when you resize it. Nobody would do that intentionally. Putting this cream on is doing the same thing. Your case is going to be floating on a film of utterly smooth, and it's going to be greatly increasing back thrust on your breech block. And over the long term, you're probably going to end up getting problems with the rifle over that. It's probably going to open up your headspace. It's going to make your block shoot loose. It's not really a very good practice. Like what I used to do is I'd load up my ammunition a day or two before for an event. I'd load up like 80 rounds of it, and my lube was a mix of at the time I think I was using olive oil, because only the best for my Sniders, and I was using olive oil, pure beeswax, and I think I was adding a little bit of Crisco at that time. now I've changed. I use canola oil because it's cheaper and it seems to work just as well. Beeswax and a little bit of wintergreen oil, which makes it smell nice. I don't think that's strictly necessary, but I had some and I added it, so it makes it smell like the Thompson Center boar butter. And what I tend to do now is just add canola oil, depending on the temperature. So in the winter, I'll add a little bit more of the canola oil. So you want it so that the lubricant liquefies as soon as it rides in the barrel. And by doing that, I was and filling the base of the bullet as well. I would fill the base of the bullet with the lube before I seated the bullets, and then it sat on top of cream of wheat filler. I never used card wads in the Snider at all, but doing it that way, you could easily shoot all day, and the fouling never became an issue. The fouling would be still liquid, and at the end of the shooting session, you could use a tightly fitting patch and just push most of the fouling out through the breech with a cleaning rod. And I did initially, when I started shooting these, I used as was synthetic beeswax, and the synthetic beeswax didn't work very well at all. Anything synthetic doesn't seem to work well. Anything petroleum based, what that had a tendency to do was turn into concrete. It hardened up. It didn't keep the powder fouling liquefied. So I went to all natural types of ingredients like oil and vegetable oil, seed oils, that type of thing, mixed with pure beeswax, and that made a huge difference. And that's all I've ever used since then. I've never bought store-bought bullet lubricants at all. And that worked really well. I never saw any need for dipping bullets into some kind of concoction. And you get that stuff, it gets all over the rifle, and it just seems kind of hokey. Just make your ammunition properly to begin with, and then you don't have to resort to that. I mean, it's totally unnecessary. But anyway, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Sniders. I'm bored. It's Saturday afternoon. The weather's kind of crummy. There's nothing much to do outside today. I haven't made a video for a while, so I just figured I'd talk about these old rifles, and I highly recommend anybody in Canada to buy one, even if you're just going to hang it on the wall, because they're an important part of our history. They're kind of like the trapdoor Springfield is to Americans, or something like that. It's they were around for a long time. Like the Canadian militia used these for over 30 years. So it's definitely worthwhile to own one or two or 5 or 8 or whatever you want to get. And it should be mentioned too that because we got so many in Canada, we actually have more beautiful British manufactured Sniders in original condition than anywhere else in the world, including their home country. They're still quite reasonably priced. You can buy one for under $1,000, which there's not much you can buy anywhere in Canada gun-wise now for that, especially something with the history of a Snider. And the brass now is reasonably inexpensive. It's not going to bankrupt you. Powder is a little bit harder to source now, but it's still out there. And I would suggest that anybody in Canada who's into reloading and into history should own at minimum one of these. Preferably, you should have the whole set. You should have the short rifle, the carbine, and the 3-band. I don't have any carbine right now. I've had them in the past. It's on my to-do list. Right now I have 2 3-bands and 2 of these short rifles. The short rifle is probably the nicest one to buy. They're They're just more well balanced. They're handier if you want to pack them around and go hunting with them. And if you can get, preferably if you can find a Mark II 2-star short rifle, but they're quite scarce in Canada, unfortunately. I should mention that the Canadian, so these rifles, first off, I'll say that they were often called a sergeant's rifle. So the sergeant of infantry regiment would usually get one of these, and the idea being that these were a superior weapon. They're more accurate, and the sergeant would be barking orders and doing things like that, so he had less time for actual shooting, so they figured they would give him a superior weapon. And also, everyone who was in the rifle regiment were supposed to get these, and the artillery were supposed to get artillery carbines. Now, Canada never bought artillery carbines for some reason, so the short rifle ended up going to the artillery. Some artillery units had them, some had 3-bands. Just imagine being an artilleryman and having to lug a 3-band infantry rifle around with you. Even these are kind of a pain in the neck. The idea behind the artillery carbines was that they were sized to fit in the limber boxes on the limber. So if something were happening, your guns were being overrun or something, then you could take the carbine out of the limber and then defend yourself while you ran away. But for some reason, Canada just never bought the artillery carbine. We never issued them. So artillery regiments got these, but most of the rifle regiments in Canada, actually I think all of them, ended up with the 3-band, which would be like for the infantry. They put a black sling on them and called it good. It wasn't until later on, quite late in the Snider era, that they actually got enough of these short rifles to issue to some of the rifle units, like the Queen's Own rifles and the Dufferin rifles and that sort of thing. But the majority of the Canadian rifle units actually ended up with infantry rifles. And as I said, a lot of these ended up with the artillery. And this one here, because the numbers were so small of the short rifles, I'm thinking that this was probably held in stores and just never issued. That's why the bore is virtually mint and the action is so tight. I think that I think the number of short rifles in the original consignment to Canada was in like the low hundreds or something, or maybe even below that. So with such a small number, it doesn't really make sense to even bother issuing them. So like I said, this was probably just held in stores and never issued, and any of the wear and tear that you see on it, like these gouges and everything, probably came from civilian life, even just being tossed around out of like various closets and everything over the last century. This one's probably never been fired in well over a century. But yeah, very interesting rifles. I suggest you buy one today. So hopefully my 3 or 4 viewers enjoy this video, and if you do, make sure you like and comment and all that stuff. One of these days maybe I'll have enough subscribers that I'll be able to have a monetized channel again. Okay, until next time, I'm gonna sign off now.